The sun had barely crept above the Hudson River when Flight 1549's sleek Airbus A320 began its ILS approach to LaGuardia. Inside the cabin, 155 souls, pilgrims of business and pleasure, settled into their seats, oblivious to the drama that would soon unfold. Children fidgeted with coloring books. Couples shared hushed greetings. A lone executive scrolled through emails on his tablet. The hum of the engines felt reassuring, a lullaby that soothed away any lingering pre-flight jitters. In the cockpit, Captain Chelsey Sully Sullenberger ran through his mental checklist with the meticulous calm of a seasoned aviator. His co-pilot, Jeff Skiles, listened intently, the two men exchanging nods that spoke of trust honed by years flying in tandem. Outside, the bright morning sky held no hint of menace, just the glow of a new day over the Big Apple. Down in the cabin, flight attendants conducted their safety demonstration with practiced grace. Soft, well-rehearsed smiles masked their constant vigilance. They knew that the difference between routine and catastrophe could hinge on the smallest detail. As the safety video ended and the seatbelt signs chimed off, a collective exhale rippled through the passengers. Business deals would be sealed, families reunited, nothing seemed amiss. But at 3,000 feet, tragedy does not send a warning. It arrives without invitation. In the cockpit, the sudden thud of bird strikes, two violent impacts, one against each engine, shivered through the aircraft. The A320 lurched, then lurched again, as both engines shuddered and died. Instinct and training collided. Alarms blared, warning lights bloomed across the instrument panel, and the comforting drone of thrust was replaced by a terrifying silence. Below, the city's rush continued. Above, in that metal tube hurtling through the sky, terror ignited. Passengers gripped armrests so tightly that knuckles whitened. Tiny hearts pounded like war drums against fragile chests. A mother inhaled sharply, trying to still the rising hysteria in her toddler's eyes. An elderly man closed his eyes, perhaps praying. In that moment, all routine vanished. There was no more business, no more sightseeing, just the stark reality of falling through air. "Brace! Brace!" came the terse command from the flight attendants, their voices steady even as their own hearts thundered. But fear is contagious. Screams echoed down the aisle. Strangers' hands found each other in the dim emergency lights, and mothers whispered prayers through trembling lips. The world outside felt impossibly distant. Amid the chaos, a single calm voice rose above. It belonged to the man who held the plane in his hands. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Sullenberger began, choosing his words carefully even as he wrestled with a plunging glide and scant altitude. "We've lost both engines. I'm going to do everything I can to put us down safely." In that moment, terror met the steadfastness of duty. Overhead bins rattled. Oxygen masks dangled like ghostly pendants, mocking the helplessness below. Yet through it all, that promise, soft-spoken, resolute, became a lifeline. "I won't let you die," he vowed in his mind, drawing on every ounce of experience, courage, and faith in his machine. As the Hudson's dark expanse loomed beneath the wings, every second stretched into an eternity. Each passenger's life flashed in rapid montage. The child's first laugh, the mother's embrace, the executive's phone call home. On the flight deck, Sully and Jeff worked as one mind, trimming flaps, coaxing the glide, bypassing procedures designed for higher altitudes, all to steer this wounded bird toward hope instead of despair. Below them, ferries and tugboats plied the water, unwitting witnesses to this unfolding miracle. On the riverbanks, ordinary New Yorkers glanced upward at the silent descent, hearts pounding in sympathetic dread. In a moment of transcendent clarity, terror gave way to a fragile trust that in a world where disasters can strike without warning, valor can still prevail. In the cabin, as the plane skimmed the water's surface, time slowed once more. Then, one final, gentle shudder, and the fuselage kissed the Hudson in a shearing spray of ice-cold foam. The aircraft settled, afloat like a wounded swan, and the stunned silence gave way to an eruption of cheers and prayers, tears and laughter. Somewhere amid the roaring engines of rescue boats, Sully whispered to himself, almost as a benediction, "You're safe now." The cold spray of Hudson River water sluiced along the cabin floor as Flight 1549 sat stranded on its new, unintended runway. Outside, rescue vessels sliced through the river's dark current, their red and blue lights strobing across the aircraft's fuselage. Inside, the panic that had gripped passengers moments before began to give way to a different kind of fear, a creeping chill that crept into bones made wet and numb by freezing water and adrenaline. The cabin, once a snug cocoon of synthetic warmth, felt cavernous. Overhead compartments, now half submerged, spilled pockets and loose belongings into the aisle. An elderly woman clutched her purse as if it were a lifeline. A couple huddled under a single thin blanket retrieved by a flight attendant who moved like a guardian angel through the frozen fog. Every exhaled breath formed a tiny cloud of frost in the cold, failing light of late January afternoon. Captain Sullenberger and First Officer Skiles peered out their shattered windows, ears ringing from the roar of pumps and sirens. Through a tiny crack in the cockpit door, the captain could see orange life rafts inflating near the wings, tethered by flimsy cords that quivered under the weight of anxious passengers. His co-pilot's calm nod reassured him, and Sully took a measured breath, his voice low over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, remain seated with your life jackets on until help arrives. Do not stand or exit until crew members direct you. We're safe for now." The order rippled through the cabin, bringing a modicum of discipline to the chaos. People pressed against one another, sharing warmth and understanding in a silent communion of survival. A young mother passed her extra blanket to a shivering grandfather. A businessman handed his coat to a teenage girl whose blue lips trembled in fear. In that moment, the fragility of human dignity shone brightest. Even in the face of catastrophe, strangers became brothers and sisters. Outside, the river's current tugged at the plane, shifting it downstream inch by inch. The sub-zero air whipped across the deck, and frost began to settle on emergency exits and window frames. Through the oval panes, passengers peered out at frantic rescuers. Fireboats pumping foam, Coast Guard cutters maneuvering into position, police launches wielding spotlight beams that danced like spectral figures on the water's surface. Each vessel carried its own mission. Some fought the river's icy grip, others cradled survivors to safety. In the aisle, flight attendants moved methodically, checking life jackets, calming tears, offering sips of water from emergency pouches. Their uniforms, soaked and plastered to their limbs, did nothing to mitigate the cold, but their professionalism radiated a warmth stronger than any fabric. One attendant, her cheeks flushed pink with exertion, knelt beside an unconscious passenger and gently rubbed his arms to stave off hypothermia until medics reached him. A soft moan drifted from the rear of the cabin as a young man, disoriented and limping, tried to make his way toward an exit. Flight attendants gently guided him back, explaining in hushed tones that everyone must stay seated until the rescue crews gave the go-ahead. The man's eyes, wide with panic, softened when they saw her calm smile, a reminder that amidst this frigid nightmare, compassion endured. Time became an elastic measure, each minute a lifetime of fear and hope intertwined. Passengers counted the seconds between each boat's arrival, gauging whether the river would claim more victims or yield them to safety. The HVAC system, now defunct, left behind a dreadful silence broken only by muffled cries and the creaking of stressed metal as the plane groaned under its own weight. In the cockpit, Sully and Jeff reviewed every detail of their ditching, angles, speeds, flap settings, cataloging the miracle they had just engineered. The flight data recorder sat quietly behind them, its memory already etched with their final desperate measures. But now was no time for reflection. The real work was ensuring every life on board reached dry land. At last, a thundering roar signaled the arrival of the New York City Fire Department's foam rigs. They encircled the plane like a protective ring of fire's antithesis, a buffer of frothy white that prevented any spark of disaster from igniting further tragedy. Officers and paramedics clambered up ladders, their faces set in grim determination. Life rafts swung alongside the doors, and one by one, passengers were helped across the icy expanse into the arms of waiting rescuers. A mother, her arms trembling, handed her toddler to a diver, tears streaking through her mascara. "Go," she whispered, voice breaking, "take her to safety." The diver nodded, carrying the child toward the nearest boat. Behind them, the mother followed, slipping and sliding on the slick fuselage, her survival propelled by a single thought: her child first. As the last passenger evacuated, Sully and Skiles remained behind to secure the cockpit, their silhouettes framed by the emergency exit's glowing sign. Then, at 3:57 p.m., both men stepped out onto the plane's wing and slid down a rope ladder, each touching the brown-gray water only briefly before being hauled into a waiting boat. In their wake, the Airbus drifted off to float silently, a steel testament to humanity's capacity for heroism. On shore, crowds gathered along the riverbanks, phones and cameras held aloft. They saw survivors stepping onto docks, faces pale but alive, and they cheered as though their own friends had returned from the brink. New York City had watched its angels descend. In the freezing twilight, the Hudson's icy embrace had become a cradle of fate. And against impossible odds, Flight 1549 had landed not in history, but as legend. The rescue boats had carried the survivors to the riverbank, but the ordeal was far from over. On the wharf, paramedics and New York Fire Department personnel formed a human chain of compassion, guiding the shaken passengers from the frigid river air into the haven of warm blankets and medical tents. Faces streaked with tears and ice, men and women leaned on rescuers as they received blankets, hot drinks, and first aid. Medical teams triaged the survivors with urgent efficiency. Some, fatigued and in shock, could only whisper their names. Others cried out, their voices raw from gasping water and swallowed fear. A flight attendant sat on a bench, legs tremoring uncontrollably as medics checked her for signs of hypothermia. Across the way, a businessman's suit jacket clung to him like a shroud. His eyes, wide and unfocused, stared at nothing and everything all at once. News helicopters hovered overhead, their blades chopping the cold air, as reporters and camera crews jostled along the shoreline. Phones rang constantly, loved ones seeking confirmation that their mother, child, or spouse had survived the seemingly impossible. "I'm okay," each passenger repeated into the phone as if saying the words aloud would make them more real. On a makeshift platform, Captain Sullenberger and First Officer Skiles stood side by side, wrapped in blankets, fielding questions from a swarm of media. Sully's eyes, rimmed in red, betrayed both exhaustion and resolve. He spoke softly, his words measured as always. "We lost both engines at 3,000 feet. Our only option was to put the aircraft down on the Hudson. I'm grateful to the crew and to the rescuers for their professionalism." The crowd erupted in applause and cheers at his final sentence, as though honoring a war hero returning from battle. Sully offered a modest smile, humbled by the adulation. Behind him, survivors lined up for more medical attention, unaware that their rescue had already become legend. Inside a nearby hospital, the injured were moved into warm examination rooms. Hypothermia protocols engaged, and IV lines dripped saline to combat dehydration. A young mother clutched her toddler to her chest, soothing his shivers with whispered lullabies. Doctors and nurses worked in concert to stabilize fractures, treat cuts from broken glass, and ensure no one slipped back into the icy grip of the river. As the hours wore on, families reunited in teary embraces. Children who had been terror-stricken just moments ago now clung to parents who could scarcely believe they were whole. A middle-aged man, wrapped in a hospital gown, boarded an ambulance alongside flight attendants who had escorted him from the plane. "Thank you," he whispered, voice cracking. "You saved my life." In the quieter corners of the hospital, survivors huddled together, sharing stories of what they had experienced. The couple seated in seats 14C and 14D recounted how they held hands through the descent, praying in unison. The grandmother, who had been traveling with her grandson, described how she covered him with her body as the plane hit the water, sacrificing her comfort to protect him from the brunt of the impact. Each story, unique yet interconnected, told of courage sparked by the will to endure. Yet even as relief washed over them, a new wave of fear crept in. What would tomorrow bring? The pilot's promise, "I'm going to do everything I can to put us down safely," had been fulfilled, but the memory of the valley of steel and frozen water lingered. Some survivors found solace in sleep, clutching each other's hands. Others stared out the window at the gray sky, haunted by the hollow feeling of freefall. Back at the makeshift command center near the river, aviation experts and the National Transportation Safety Board began assembling the puzzle pieces. They interviewed crew members, gathered flight data, and examined the recovered engines. Sully and Skiles cooperated fully, providing meticulous accounts of every lever pulled and decision made in those critical minutes. Their calm under pressure and the seamless coordination with air traffic control would later be studied by pilots and taught in flight schools worldwide. That night, in the city that never sleeps, the story of Flight 1549 spread like wildfire. Social media buzzed with praise for the miracle on the Hudson. Hashtags trended, news outlets replayed cockpit audio of Sully's calm announcements, and experts lauded the crew's decision-making as textbook excellence. But amid the accolades, survivors grappled with the quieter truths. Nightmares of plunging through dark skies, the sting of cold water in their lungs, the brief flash of terror that had told them their lives might end. In a small hospital room, two young strangers who had sat rows apart on the flight now found themselves side by side, bound by shared trauma. They closed their eyes and imagined that moment of impact, then breathed deeply, reminding themselves they were still alive. Beyond the walls, ambulances carried the last of the injured away, and the city settled into an uneasy calm. As dawn approached, the first light of a new day glinted off the East River. For the survivors of Flight 1549, the future held questions they never expected to ask. How would they process their trauma? Would the images of that fateful glide haunt their dreams? And most of all, how could they ever repay the debt they owed to their crew, their rescuers, and that unwavering promise that they would not die? Though the engines had fallen silent, the echoes of their survival reverberated far beyond that cold January afternoon. In every heartbeat, in every tear shed and embrace shared, the story lived on, a testament to human courage, compassion, and the unbreakable bond between pilot and passenger. Dawn's pale light filtered through the linen curtains of the makeshift briefing room at LaGuardia Airport's temporary operations center. Rows of chairs faced a long table strewn with flight charts, sticky notes, and steaming coffee cups. Aviation investigators, airline executives, and legal advisors gathered in hushed clusters, their faces a mix of concern and solemn duty. At the head of the table sat Captain Chelsey Sullenberger and First Officer Jeffrey Skiles, flanked by their attorneys, prepared to recount every decision, every lever moved, and every heartbeat that had pulsed in the cockpit of Flight 1549. For Sully, the weight of that day settled on his shoulders like a lead vest. In the quiet hours since the ditching, he had replayed the bird strike again and again in his mind. The sudden jolt at 2,800 feet, the immediate realization that both engines were gone, the instinctive slide of the throttles to idle, the calm acknowledgement to Jeff that we've lost thrust. Training had endowed him with procedures, but nothing could replace the split-second judgment rendered at 3,000 feet over Manhattan. As the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, lead investigator called out key moments, engine failure, dual, glide ratio, altitude loss, decision-making time, Sully spoke clearly and deliberately. He described how, within seconds, he had scanned the gauges, estimated reachable airports, and concluded that LaGuardia and Teterboro were both out of reach without sufficient altitude. His voice remained steady, though his knuckles tightened around the edge of the table. "Captain Sullenberger," the investigator pressed, "why the Hudson?" Sully drew in a breath, eyes distant. "Because every second counted. With no thrust, the glide slope was predetermined. With only 208 seconds of glide time at best, I had to choose a flat surface without obstacles." The Hudson's width and sparse vessel traffic offered the only viable runway. The room fell silent. Hushed murmurs passed among the attendees. Murky river water doubling as lifeline, narrow margin between survival and catastrophe, heroic calculus by a man bound by duty. Meanwhile, in the corporate offices of U.S. Airways, executives pored over cabin recordings, radio transmissions, and maintenance logs. The executive in charge of operations scribbled notes. No prior engine warnings, routine bird hazard procedures, impeccable maintenance records. Yet, despite perfect conditions on paper, real life had conspired to deliver chaos. Beyond the sterile meeting rooms, the crews and survivors wrestled with their own judgments. Flight attendants, trained for rapid evacuation, had executed the brace command and then moved to clear aisles, inflate vests, and direct passengers to life rafts. In their debriefing, each described the torrent of shouts, the muffled screams, and the flash of determination that propelled them forward. They had moments to think, minutes, even seconds, but acted swiftly, often saving lives through split-second choices to hold a door open or calm a frightened child. In the hospital corridors, some survivors confronted the different kind of scrutiny, the inner scrutiny of survival guilt. A young father who had unbuckled his seatbelt to help an elderly woman onto a raft questioned whether he had jeopardized his own safety. A businesswoman who had encouraged calm in her roommates found herself reliving the moment she relinquished her own blanket. Each decision, however small, felt like a weight pressing on their chests. Outside, the city that prided itself on its toughness offered its comfort in small miracles. A cafe near the riverbank opened early for the search teams and families, brewing endless pots of coffee. Strangers brought blankets, clothes, and warm coats to the airport's reception area. Volunteers offered blankets and sandwiches to survivors who emerged from debriefings looking as though they just faced winter's merciless chill. Yet for Sully and Jeff, for the flight attendants and the passengers, the hardest questions remained unspoken. Could they have done more? Should they have called a mayday sooner? Was turning back toward LaGuardia worth the gamble? As investigators reviewed cockpit voice recordings, even a split-second hesitation became a subject of scrutiny. At mid-morning, the NTSB team paused for a logistical break. Sully stepped outside, the sharp fragrance of jet fuel still in the air. He found a quiet spot behind a hangar, the river's frozen sheen glinting in the distance. In a moment of vulnerability, he allowed himself to remember the immediate aftermath of impact. The deafening spray of water, the alarmed chorus of "brace" twisting into a collective cheer when the hull stabilized. He recalled how, even as the plane sank past its wings, he had felt an absurd calm, a realization that his training had led him here, that every procedure and every hour of practice had culminated in this strange dance with fate. Behind him, footsteps approached. It was First Officer Skiles, his face sober but supportive. "How are you holding up?" Jeff asked, voice low enough to be private in the open air. Sully managed a small smile. "I'm okay, just thinking about everyone back there." Jeff nodded. "We did what we do best." "We did," Sully agreed, exhaling. "But sometimes I wonder if the next time we'll be so lucky." Inside the operations center, afternoon sunlight slanted through the blinds. The NTSB lead investigator reconvened the meeting, calling Sully and Jeff back inside. As they took their seats, Sully straightened, muscles coiling beneath his flight suit. He prepared to continue the chronology: air traffic control communications, water evacuation procedures, rescue coordination. Around the table, the gulf between data and humanity narrowed. Maps, charts, and time logs slid aside as the human story asserted itself. A pilot's oath to protect, a co-pilot's unwavering support, a crew's fierce dedication, and passengers' fragile will to live. In that room, unraveling the tapestry of cause and effect, they faced the ultimate question of aviation and of life. When everything fails, what is the measure of success? As the meeting pressed on, Sully steeled himself to recount the final minutes before impact, every flap adjustment, every radio call, every heartbeat. And though the decision had been made in the span of a breath, its repercussions would echo for decades to come, shaping aviation safety, heroism, and the understanding that, in the face of calamity, the greatest measure of skill lies in the courage to make the hardest call. In the days following the Hudson landing, the world buzzed with awe and relief. Yet for the survivors and crew of Flight 1549, the true work had only begun. In cramped hotel conference rooms and quiet hospital wards, the rawness of what had occurred settled like a weight upon every soul who had shared that frozen glide. They gathered, in groups or individually, to speak, to unburden, and to search for meaning in the face of what nearly became tragedy. The Survivors' Circle. On the second evening after the incident, a makeshift support meeting convened at a small conference room in a midtown Manhattan hotel. Survivors, clad in sweatpants and sweaters, filled folding chairs set in a loose circle. The room smelled of coffee, antiseptic, and tension. A counselor invited each person to share their story. One by one, voices cracked open memories sealed by shock and fear. The elderly woman who'd clung to her purse trembled as she recalled the moment the engines died. "I thought it was the end. I could feel my life slipping away with that silent drop." A teenage boy, his arms still in a sling, described how he had squeezed his mother's hand so hard he later discovered bruises on his own fingers. A businessman confessed that, in the panic, he had frozen momentarily, guilt now shadowing every waking thought. Yet interwoven with the terror were threads of unexpected grace. A young flight attendant, her hair still damp from the Hudson spray, remembered how terrified passengers had softly sung lullabies to frightened children while awaiting rescue. A group of strangers, seated in the same exit row, had learned each other's names and reassured one another that help was coming, turning alien passengers into comrades bound by hope. As each survivor spoke, tears were shed, but so were smiles of gratitude. They realized that in the crucible of danger, humanity's better angels had taken flight. The circle closed with a moment of silence, a collective acknowledgement that they were not alone in their fear, nor alone in their healing. Pilot and co-pilot, brotherhood beyond duty. Meanwhile, in a private debriefing room at the airline's headquarters, Captain Sullenberger and First Officer Skiles reflected on their shared ordeal. Surrounded by company officials and aviation psychologists, they discussed the interplay of trust and instinct that had guided their actions. "Remember how we looked at each other when the first engine died?" Jeff asked, voice low. "It wasn't panic, just understanding." Sully nodded. "We knew we had one shot, no room for doubt." They spoke of the countless hours of simulator training that suddenly became very real, of the importance of calm communication, how Sully's brief announcement to passengers had cut through fear rather than inflame it, and how Jeff's steady handling of checklists had kept them on glide path even as alarms screamed. In that room, their bond was evident, not just as colleagues, but as brothers who had looked into the abyss together and emerged the better for it. Neither man spoke of heroism. They spoke of responsibility and relief, that they had done their duty and that every passenger had walked away. The family toll. Back at home, families wrestled with their own emotional aftermath. News networks had broadcast every heartbeat of the story, from cockpit audio to survivor interviews. A mother in Seattle watched her daughter on TV clutching a blanket and sobbing. A father in Chicago couldn't sleep, imagining the thud of bird strikes and the cold splash of water. For some, every phone ring triggered a rush of dread. For others, a siren in the distance felt like a personal reminder of that fateful day. Support hotlines were overwhelmed by callers seeking reassurance. "Is it normal to jump at the sound of an airplane overhead?" asked one elderly man. "Why do I keep replaying the safety demonstration video in my head?" wondered a flight attendant from another airline who'd watched from her own cabin that day. Yet from these private struggles arose networks of support. Local trauma groups offered meetings for those affected. Clergy opened their doors for prayerful intercession. And online forums connected strangers whose lives had brushed against Flight 1549. In virtual chat rooms, survivors and observers shared poems, sketches, and messages of solidarity. Small beacons of comfort in a world that suddenly felt more fragile. A city's gratitude. In New York City, gratitude took on physical form. Commemorative plaques were proposed for pilings along the Hudson. A local artist painted a mural of the A320 skimming above the water, wings reflected in the ripples below. Fireboats performed a water salute, spraying arcs of mist high into the sky in honor of the crew and passengers. Mayor's offices coordinated letters of commendation. The Port Authority awarded medals to the flight attendants. Coast Guard and FDNY personnel received commendations for the swift rescue. Newspapers ran full-page spreads featuring the smiling faces of survivors and the modest heroism of those who saved them. Yet beneath the ceremonies lay a quiet humility. Captain Sullenberger, in interviews, deflected praise. "I'm just a pilot who did his job." Flight attendants demurred at parades held in their honor. Rescue crews said they were simply doing what any first responder would do. The unseen ripples. But the true measure of their impact would unfold in years to come. Aviation schools would teach this case study, emphasizing the human factors as much as the technical, how leadership under duress can be the difference between life and death. Psychologists would analyze survivor resilience, studying how communal stories of solidarity aid in recovery. Families once fractured by distance found unity in shared relief, reminding them that every day together was a gift earned at 3,000 feet above Manhattan. For those on Flight 1549, the ripples extended into careers, relationships, and worldviews. A former skeptic of air travel began advocating for improved bird control measures at airports. A young passenger pursued studies in emergency medicine. A flight attendant, inspired by her colleagues' courage, enrolled in crisis counseling courses. In quiet moments, watching gulls skimming the Hudson, riding the subway beneath the city, or staring at the sky on a clear day, survivors felt the steady pulse of second chances. They knew that life's fragility was matched only by its power to inspire acts of purpose and compassion. And so, as city lights blinked on that evening and skyscrapers stood sentinel along the river, the legacy of Flight 1549 unfolded not just in accolades or investigations, but in the lives forever changed and forever grateful to the pilot who vowed, "I won't let you die." As the initial shock faded into the hum of everyday life, Flight 1549's passengers and crew found themselves cast not only as survivors, but as critical witnesses in one of aviation's most scrutinized investigations. In a cavernous hangar at an NTSB facility outside Washington, D.C., the wrecked engines lay splayed out on steel tables, their casings peppered with avian feathers and impact scars. Floodlights illuminated every dent, every shattered turbine blade, while engineers, lawyers, and safety experts circled like detectives examining evidence in a high-stakes trial. Captain Sullenberger, First Officer Skiles, and the cabin crew faced a grueling schedule of interviews, depositions, and technical walkthroughs. Each question posed by the NTSB about stick forces, flap settings, radio communications, bird avoidance measures cut sharply against the raw memory of impact. For the crew, recounting those moments meant reopening emotional wounds. The sickening jolt as birds struck at 2,800 feet, the instant that both engines went silent, the desperate glide toward the dark river below. Yet they answered with unwavering candor, knowing that dissecting every decision could prevent future tragedies. Behind closed doors, safety investigators reconstructed the scenario in full-motion simulators. Pilots sat strapped into replica cockpits, recreating Sully's precise control inputs, the pitch adjustment to maintain optimal glide speed, the flap extension sequence, the crosswind compensation as the A320 drifted above the currents. Teams of engineers adjusted parameters. What if the birds had hit only one engine? What if the river currents had been stronger? Each variation honed the industry's collective understanding of dual engine failure dynamics. In parallel, forensic metallurgists analyzed fragments of the engine's fan disks, documenting fracture patterns to confirm that the strikes had sheared through compressor blades, causing immediate loss of thrust. Biologists identified the species, Canada geese, each weighing up to 10 pounds, underscoring the growing risk posed by migratory flocks encroaching on airport airspace. Their findings would ripple through federal wildlife management policies, prompting stricter habitat controls around major runways. The cabin crew, too, underwent meticulous review. Investigators pored over cockpit cabin intercom recordings and cabin surveillance footage, timing every brace command and evacuation instruction. They measured how long it took flight attendants to assess cabin conditions, inflate vests, and guide passengers to exits. Their goal was to refine best practices, how to optimize brace postures, how to prioritize exits in water landings, and how to coordinate with rescue authorities in real time. For Sully, the investigation was a baptism by fire. Each retelling of the ditching reminded him of the weight he carried, 155 lives balanced on the edge of his split-second decisions. Yet he also felt a sense of purpose. His detailed feedback would become part of the official report, shaping pilot training syllabi and simulator scenarios worldwide. He saw how data points on a chart translated into real lives saved or lost. Meanwhile, families of survivors and the few who had suffered injuries followed the investigation closely. They read every press release, hoping that lessons drawn from Flight 1549 would lead to improved safety for all air travelers. Many penned letters to the NTSB, urging that the final recommendations be binding rather than advisory. A grassroots coalition of aviation advocates formed, lobbying Congress to mandate advanced bird strike avoidance systems and enhanced crew resource management courses. In the heart of the NTSB's conference room, the lead investigator, her brow creased in concentration, prepared the draft report. She wove together cockpit voice transcripts, flight data recorder outputs, metallurgical analyses, and eyewitness testimonies. The narrative that emerged was both technical and human, a precise timeline of seconds and procedures, interlaced with the captain's calm, unwavering voice and the flight attendant's courageous leadership under pressure. As the report neared completion, anticipation grew across the aviation community. Will the recommendations be strong enough? Would regulators adopt them? Airlines worldwide awaited guidance that could affect maintenance budgets, runway design, and training programs. Sully, now a global symbol of airmanship, reviewed the draft safety proposals. Stricter wildlife hazard management around airports, mandatory dual-engine failure drills at low altitudes, and improved cockpit cabin communication protocols. He provided clarifications where necessary, ensuring the final document reflected the reality of the frozen glide. On the day the report was unveiled, a hush fell over the industry. In a press conference outside the NTSB headquarters, investigators delivered their findings. Flight 1549's ditching was the optimal outcome given the conditions, they declared, and they issued a suite of recommendations designed to bolster bird strike prevention, refine emergency descent protocols, and enhance passenger evacuation procedures. Sully and Skiles stood beside the investigators, their presence a living testament to the report's human stakes. As cameras flashed, Captain Sullenberger spoke once more, this time not from the cockpit, but from the heart of safety advocacy. Our experience proved that with rigorous training, clear communication, and swift action, we can turn calamity into triumph. But we must remain vigilant. Implementing these recommendations will honor not just the events of January 15, 2009, but the trust that every passenger places in us when they board an aircraft. The impact was immediate. Airports invested in new radar systems to detect bird flocks. Airlines updated their simulator curricula to include low-altitude dual-engine failure scenarios. Regulatory bodies fast-tracked mandates on runway perimeter fencing and wildlife dispersal teams. Flight attendants worldwide re-examined their water landing procedures, incorporating insights gleaned from the Hudson ordeal. In classrooms, in boardrooms, and on runways, Flight 1549's legacy took flight as a global movement towards safer skies. And for those who had lived through the miracle on the Hudson, the investigation was more than an after-action report. It was the next chapter in a story of human resilience, where the lessons learned would guide every future flight toward a safer horizon. Life after the Hudson landing was not a neatly wrapped package. For Flight 1549 survivors, the world resumed its rhythms. But beneath the surface, each heartbeat carried a memory no ordinary morning coffee could wash away. Daylight revealed unseen tremors, a startle at the rumble of a passing engine, a furtive glance at the sky, or a sudden tightening of the chest when a bird swooped overhead. In suburban living rooms and high-rise apartments, survivors struggled to reconcile the miracle on the Hudson with their ongoing lives. A schoolteacher in Queens found herself pausing mid-lesson whenever her classroom window rattled. The sound catapulted her mind back to the shudder of impact. A hedge fund analyst in Manhattan replayed cockpit audio before every flight, mentally rehearsing Sully's calm cadence as a shield against panic. The shared ordeal had become a private companion, sometimes a guide, sometimes a wraith. Healing hearts one story at a time. To confront these shadows, many survivors turned to storytelling. Local community centers hosted meetings where passengers gathered to speak their truths, weaving personal narratives into a collective tapestry of resilience. In one such meeting, held in a modest parish hall near Hoboken, a woman described how she'd awakened from a nap just seconds before the engines died. If not for that blink of wakefulness, her memory of the incident would be forever blank. Others recounted how they'd prayed aloud, some in familiar verses, others in simple, improvised pleas for mercy to anyone who might listen. Listening became an act of healing. When one attendee shared that she still couldn't bring herself to board a plane, another chimed in that she'd taken her first post-Flight 1549 flight just last week, tears streaming down her face at takeoff. Their stories, so different yet anchored in the same frozen glide, created a mirror in which each could see both their pain and their progress. By giving voice to that terrifying descent, they reclaimed power from a memory that had once robbed them of choice. Gatherings of gratitude. Amid the ongoing healing, gratitude took new forms. On the 6-month anniversary of the ditching, a group of survivors chartered a boat on the Hudson. They circled the approximate ditching site at sunset, icebreaker lights cutting through twilight's gloom. A small ceremony unfolded on the deck, led by a minister whose own journey through panic made him a fitting guide. He spoke of hope as a thrilling, fragile gift, like a flock of geese, free to soar but unexpectedly vulnerable. Each attendee then read aloud a short note, a grace they'd penned for fellow survivors. One message, held by a former flight attendant, read, "To the man in 12B, thank you for pressing my hand when I told you to brace. Your calm saved my courage." Another, addressed to the pilots, ended simply, "Because of you, I believe in angels still." Tears and smiles followed in equal measure as the sun dipped below the skyline. Forging new paths. Transformation took root in the survivors' professional and personal pursuits. A marketing executive who'd been returning from a conference used her severance package months later to launch a nonprofit dedicated to aerospace safety advocacy. A retired school principal enrolled at a local college to study psychology, hoping to work with trauma survivors, her own experience offering her unique empathy. Even within the airline industry, changes blossomed. Flight attendants who had weathered the cold spray of the Hudson introduced new peer support networks, ensuring that crews affected by emergency landings could access counseling quickly and confidentially. For Captain Sullenberger and First Officer Skiles, resilience manifested in public and private spheres alike. Sully continued flying commercial routes, each takeoff and landing a reaffirmation of faith in aviation. Between flights, he lectured at universities and pilot academies, emphasizing that technical mastery must always be grounded in human connection. The quiet reassurance of a pilot's voice, the simple act of calling out "brace" at the right moment. Jeff Skiles, meanwhile, took on a mentorship role at a major airlines training division, guiding young co-pilots through simulator exercises that now included low-altitude dual-engine failures, exercises born directly from their shared ordeal. The bonds of fellowship. Perhaps the most enduring threads of resilience were the bonds that formed between strangers on that fateful flight. These connections, born in terror, blossomed into friendships that survived freezer temperatures and thinning ice. The couple in seats 14C and 14D, whose clasped hands carried them through the descent, chose to celebrate their joint birthday parties thereafter with themed Miracle on the Hudson invites. The teenage boy who bruised his mother's hand later asked a fellow adolescent survivor to be his best man at his wedding, their shared trauma lending sacred weight to the request. They formed online groups, exchanging holiday greetings and life updates, and occasionally returning to the Hudson's banks for gatherings that were equal parts remembrance and rejoicing. In these moments, survivors acknowledged the fragility of life while celebrating its tenacity. Each hug, each shared laugh, each quiet nod was a testament to the unseen threads that bound them. Echoes in the sky. Even the skies above bore witness to their ongoing journey. A retired naval pilot who now flew sightseeing tours over the Hudson incorporated a brief flyover of the ditching site into each itinerary, an homage to the miracle that had taken place. Passengers aboard his tour planes often gasped as he pointed out the spot where the river's brown currents met the Manhattan skyline like a silent meeting of past and present. Above all, the survivors learned that resilience is not a destination, but a daily commitment. It's the refusal to let fear dictate life's terms, the willingness to offer help where once panic reigned, and the conscious choice to live fully, honoring every breath by clinging to hope. In living rooms, conference halls, and the expanse of the Hudson River itself, the story of Flight 1549 continued to unfold, not as a singular event locked in history, but as a living tapestry of human courage. And though the engines had failed that January afternoon, the flame of resilience burned on, sustained by the unbreakable promise that had echoed through the cabin: "I won't let you die." Months had passed since the miracle on the Hudson, but the reverberations of Flight 1549's extraordinary ditching continued to reshape aviation, wildlife management, and personal lives alike. From the boardrooms of international airlines to the quiet offices of local wildlife officers, the lessons learned that day were woven into new policies, procedures, and practices designed to prevent history from repeating itself. A new era in bird hazard management. At JFK and LaGuardia airports, perimeter fences were extended and reinforced to discourage wildlife from gathering on runways. State-of-the-art radar systems, capable of detecting flocks of geese as small as a dozen birds, were installed along critical flight paths. Air traffic control staff received specialized training to interpret radar feeds and issued timely bird strike advisories to pilots. Wildlife biologists, once confined to seasonal migratory studies, now worked alongside airport operations teams year-round, monitoring local habitats and coordinating dispersal efforts with trained falconry units and pyrotechnic deterrents. In workshops and conferences worldwide, wildlife hazard experts cited Flight 1549 as the catalyst for a more aggressive, science-based approach to avian control. Drone surveillance projects sprouted at major hubs, enabling rapid identification of bird roosts, even in remote wetlands. Environmental agencies and airlines forged collaborative agreements, long viewed as improbable alliances, sharing data on bird migration patterns and investing in conservation efforts to relocate high-risk species safely away from airports. Advancements in cockpit training. Meanwhile, pilot training programs were overhauled to incorporate realistic dual-engine failure scenarios at low altitudes. Full-motion simulators now ran Hudson modules. Pilots faced sudden thrust loss over urban landscapes and had only seconds to choose between attempting a return to the airport or executing a water ditching. Evaluations emphasized crew resource management, encouraging captains and first officers to speak up assertively and coordinate with flight attendants and controllers under extreme stress. Flight schools invited Captain Sullenberger and First Officer Skiles to co-host seminars, sharing first-hand accounts of decision points where instincts and procedures intersected. Video recordings of cockpit voice communications from Flight 1549 became training staples, illustrating the power of concise, calm announcement phrasing to manage passenger expectations and maintain cabin discipline. Revised evacuation and survival protocols. Cabin safety protocols evolved too. Flight attendants across carriers received enhanced training in water evacuation, including the rapid deployment and boarding of life rafts in strong currents. New glide path calculators were installed in cockpits, giving flight crews instant estimates of reachable landing surfaces in the event of total thrust loss. Passengers encountered updated safety cards that depicted water landing brace positions and life vest inflation techniques more clearly than ever before. In the wake of Flight 1549, manufacturers tweaked door designs to ensure easier opening under pressure. Raft grab lines were lengthened, and escape ropes were color-coded for rapid identification. Airlines introduced pre-flight reminders, either via brief cabin announcements or digital screens, highlighting the procedures for ditching scenarios, aiming to reduce confusion and speed up evacuations. Memorials and commemorations. On the one-year anniversary of the Hudson landing, the Port Authority unveiled a memorial plaque at the Wall Street Pier. Inscribed in polished steel, it read, "Here, on January 15, 2009, Flight 1549's crew demonstrated the highest standard of airmanship. In cold waters and under pressure, they preserved every life on board." Survivors returned to the pier for a quiet ceremony. Children who had been on the flight now walked unburdened by frozen terror, guided by parents who told stories of that day not as nightmare but as testament to human courage. Co-pilots, rescue crew members, and wildlife officers stood shoulder to shoulder, unified by a shared purpose that transcended individual roles. A lone bugler played Amazing Grace, the haunting notes carried across the water, mingling with the wake of passing ferries. Personal transformations. Back in their daily lives, survivors continued to honor the lessons of Flight 1549 in personal ways. A former investment banker donated to charitable organizations supporting aviation safety research. A teacher in Connecticut incorporated the story into her physics curriculum, using real-world data to demonstrate lift, thrust, and glide ratios, inspiring students to see mathematics in motion. Flight attendants formed an alumni network that met quarterly to mentor newcomers in crisis leadership, ensuring that the ethos of compassion and decisiveness endured. Captain Sullenberger, now a prominent safety advocate, consulted with international regulators on drafting global standards for bird strike prevention. He worked with industry bodies to codify human factors protocols, emphasizing that technology must be matched by clear communication and robust teamwork. Jeff Skiles continued to fly commercial routes, but also lectured at aviation symposiums, reminding professionals that every procedure is only as good as its real-world execution under pressure. A lasting promise. Above it all, the promise that had become Flight 1549's heart, "I won't let you die," remained a guiding principle. It echoed in every safety briefing, every training drill, and every policy debate about aviation's future. The story of that January afternoon became more than a singular event. It became a blueprint for resilience, collaboration, and the unwavering commitment to protect lives in the face of the unexpected. As dusk settled over the Hudson River and the Manhattan skyline shimmered in twilight, the legacy of Flight 1549 glowed brighter than any memorial plaque. It lived on in the instruments that measured bird movements, in the simulators where pilots honed their craft, and in the hearts of all those who understood that, in aviation, as in life, the greatest triumph lies not in avoiding adversity, but in rising to meet it with skill, compassion, and a promise kept. Long after the headlines faded and the news crews packed up their cameras, the true journey of Flight 1549 survivors unfolded inward, in the quiet chambers of memory and the hidden corridors of the heart. For each passenger and crew member, life resumed its familiar rhythms, commutes, meetings, family dinners, but beneath the surface lay a new imperative: to integrate the ordeal into the tapestry of their identities, transforming trauma into purpose. Reclaiming the sky. For many, the first return to flight was a watershed moment. Airlines reported a measured increase in bookings accompanied by queries. "Do you remember Flight 1549? Will that route take us over water?" Flight instructors, aware of lingering anxieties, began offering specialized courses in coping with in-flight stress, drawing on survivors' insights to calibrate realistic reassurance techniques. In cabins across the globe, flight attendants shared the story of the miracle on the Hudson, not as a scare tactic, but as a testament to what can happen when training, technology, and teamwork align under duress. One survivor, a young architect named Michael, found solace when he signed up for a short domestic hop from Chicago to Denver. As the engines roared to life, his palms sweated and his heart raced. Memories of dual-engine failure surged unbidden. He closed his eyes, recalled Captain Sullenberger's calm voice, and gripped the armrest until liftoff. When the wheels lifted from the runway without incident, Michael exhaled a breath he hadn't known he was holding. He realized then that reclaiming the sky required confronting fear, moment by trembling moment. Art and memory. Across the city, creative responses to the Hudson landing blossomed. A Brooklyn gallery hosted an exhibition titled Wings of Resilience, featuring charcoal sketches of the Airbus A320, fragments of cockpit voice transcripts rendered in calligraphy, and audio installations that let visitors listen to every breath, every click of a switch from that pivotal flight. Survivors contributed artifacts, scarred life jackets, frayed glove liners, a single earring found on the cabin floor, each object a tangible link to the past. Visitors wrote reflections on strips of blue paper, tacking them alongside the installations. "I found my courage in the silence of descent. We held hands so tightly that morning, I learned the true power of human touch." Through art, the community processed collective trauma, acknowledging that while statistics and safety reports speak in numbers, the human story is told in whispers, in tears, in the steady rise of hope. Educating the next generation. In schools from Seattle to Miami, teachers wove Flight 1549's narrative into lessons on physics, biology, and leadership. Students built paper jet models to test glide ratios, studied the migratory patterns of Canada geese in science class, and held mock crisis response drills in civics. One middle schooler, Maya, wrote an essay that won a national contest. The Hudson miracle taught me that preparation and empathy can steer us through the darkest storms. Her teacher, moved to tears, realized that the legacy of one flight had become a catalyst for countless lives learning to navigate uncertainty. Colleges invited Sully and Skiles to guest lecture in aeronautical engineering and psychology departments. Young engineers pored over the NTSB report, dissecting spline calculations and stress tolerances. Psychology students organized panels on post-traumatic growth, interviewing survivors about resilient strategies and support systems. In this cross-disciplinary approach, Flight 1549 bridged divides between STEM and the humanities, proving that raw data and raw emotion both have vital roles in understanding human experience. Philanthropy and advocacy. Survivors, moved by gratitude and a desire to give back, launched foundations targeting aviation safety and victim support. The Hudson Hope Initiative provided scholarships for children of rescue workers and funded research into new radar technologies for bird detection. Annual fundraising galas featured keynote addresses by crew members and interactive flight simulators where donors could fly the Hudson under guidance from veteran pilots. Through philanthropy, the story that began with panic on the river evolved into sustained action for a safer, more compassionate world. Forging inner peace. Yet amid activism, the most profound work happened in solitude. Survivors spoke of the flight within, the personal odyssey from survivor to thriver. Some turned to meditation, using guided imagery to replace scenes of plummeting through cold air with visions of soaring above golden clouds. Others embraced journaling, mapping their emotional trajectories from the instant of impact to the day they first smiled without tears on another plane. Support groups devised resilience retreats along the Hudson shore, where attendees practiced mindfulness and shared stories under the banner of renewal. For flight attendants and crew, the journey was equally introspective. They convened peer-led workshops on grief and guilt management, recognizing that saving lives can carry its own emotional toll. Therapists trained in trauma care joined forces with airline wellness programs to embed mental health check-ins into mandatory rest periods, ensuring that those who care for passengers receive care in return. A new horizon. As the sun set on another anniversary of Flight 1549, the Hudson skyline glowed with the same quiet grace that had seen the plane's descent. Ferries crossed the river's ribbon of water, unaware of the stories woven beneath their hulls. For the survivors, however, each ripple in the current carried the echo of that fateful day, and the assurance that human courage can transcend the void. In the end, the greatest legacy of Flight 1549 was not the policies rewritten or the technologies deployed, but the steadfast realization that when everything seems lost, the heart's promise to protect, to endure, to lift one another remains our truest compass. More than a year after Flight 1549's hull came to rest in the Hudson, its lessons had taken root in every corner of the aviation world. From the gleaming corridors of corporate headquarters to the simulators humming deep within flight training centers. Yet perhaps the most profound transformation unfolded in the sanctuaries of learning, where instructors and students alike discovered that the miracle on the Hudson was as much a lesson in human dynamics as it was in aerodynamics. Simulator halls and emergency drills. At the Star Aviation Training Academy near Atlanta, rows of full-motion simulators stood like silent sentinels. Each bore the sleek lettering A320 on its side, but within, bespoke modules replayed the April 2009 revisions. Low-altitude dual-engine failure scenarios programmed to mimic the exact feather strike dynamics of the Hudson descent. As trainees filed in, they carried with them the gravity of Flight 1549's legacy. Instructors, many of whom had attended seminars led by Captain Sullenberger, began each session with a brief recounting of the ditching. No dry statistics, but the human story. The collective gasp as alarms blared, the steadiness of Sully's voice, and the seconds that stretched into lifetimes before the plane gently settled on water. With that narrative as backdrop, students strapped into harnesses and prepared to face the same decision points. Whether to attempt a return to the airport or glide toward an alternative surface, all within the unforgiving envelope of minimal altitude. When the simulated bird strike occurred, engine audio died, warnings flared, the cabin lights dimmed, reactions varied from stunned silence to sharp commands. In debriefings, instructors emphasized not only technical inputs, but also the emotional undercurrents. The necessity of clear communication with co-pilots, the importance of swift, decisive action, and the moral imperative to balance protocol with intuition. The role of cabin crew in crisis. Down the hall, cabin service trainees joined specialized workshops focused on water evacuations. Classroom walls were lined with enlarged safety card illustrations revamped after Flight 1549. Life vest donning techniques, brace positions refined for zero-thrust landings, and exit door operations simplified with color-coded handles. A mock cabin setup, complete with flickering emergency light bulbs and a tilted floor, allowed attendants to practice guiding passengers through darkened aisles to life rafts that floated in simulated currents. Veteran flight attendants recounted how, on that icy January afternoon, they balanced urgency with reassurance. They described tethering themselves to seats to maintain center of gravity, checking every life vest buckle, and leading passengers step by trembling step onto rafts that bobbed like fragile lilies on the river surface. Instructors urged trainees to channel that same composure, teaching them that courage under pressure is as teachable as any checklist procedure. Academic integration beyond the cockpit. While simulators and mock cabins brought the physical reality of Flight 1549 to life, universities wove its tale into broader curricula. At Metropolitan State School of Management, a course titled Crisis Leadership and Organizational Resilience devoted an entire unit to Sully's decision-making framework. MBA students dissected transcripts of cockpit communications, identifying moments when decisive brevity averted panic and fostered collective trust. They debated the ethics of risk trade-offs. Was choosing a water landing ethically superior to an attempted return that might have endangered more lives on the ground? In engineering departments, young aerodynamicists pored over glide ratio charts, comparing theoretical calculations with Flight 1549's real-world performance. Their thesis projects ranged from designing next-generation composite fan blades resistant to bird strike damage to crafting adaptive flight control algorithms that automatically optimize flap settings during engine-out scenarios. In every data point and design sketch, the Hudson's dark water served as both inspiration and cautionary tale. Public outreach and STEM advocacy. Outside academia, public outreach initiatives carried Flight 1549's legacy into schools and community centers. The AeroGuard Foundation, co-founded by a group of survivors, hosted Hudson Day events, inviting families to explore static displays of life rafts, aviation headsets, and flight deck instruments. Children slid down rescue ladder replicas, while parents listened to pilot panels that stressed the interplay of technology, training, and teamwork. These community gatherings emphasized STEM careers, spotlighting how a geologist studying bird migration patterns or a software engineer programming bird detection radar could play a pivotal role in aviation safety. Displays featured interactive simulations where participants made split-second decisions, feeling firsthand the weight of choices that Captain Sullenberger once bore. By humanizing the mechanics of flight, these outreach programs inspired a new generation to see science and empathy as inseparable wings of progress. A classroom of humanity. Yet amid the simulators and lectures, instructors stressed that Flight 1549's ultimate lesson transcended mechanical procedures. It was a classroom of humanity, where the bonds between pilot and co-pilot, crew and passengers, and even strangers on the riverbank became the greatest safety net. As one veteran instructor summed up in a keynote address at the annual International Aviation Symposium, We can perfect our engines and refine our protocols, but without the steadfast courage to say, "I won't let you die," our technology remains inert. In this holistic approach, the miracle on the Hudson remained alive, not as a relic confined to nostalgia, but as a living curriculum that guided every ascent, every descent, and every heartbeat aloft. For those who passed through these halls, pilots, engineers, flight attendants, and students alike, the story of Flight 1549 served as both technical blueprint and moral compass, reminding them that in the sky's vast classroom, the measure of mastery is found at the intersection of skill and heart. Nearly 2 years after Flight 1549's fateful descent, the bond between water and sky that once threatened so many lives had become a source of profound connection, linking survivors to each other, to first responders, and to the natural world that both nurtured and imperiled them. In communities along the Hudson River, that connection took shape in art, advocacy, and quiet moments of reflection, forging a network of resilience that rippled far beyond any single shoreline. Ripples in the community. On a crisp spring morning, a group of survivors gathered at Riverside Park in Manhattan for the inaugural Hudson Harmony Walk, a memorial stroll organized by volunteers from the city's trauma recovery centers. As they walked the promenade, the river's gentle swell whispered against the quay walls, a soft reminder of January's icy roar. Survivors strolled side by side, some in wheelchairs or leaning on canes, each wearing a white pin embossed with the silhouette of the A320's wing on water. Along the route, stations hosted poetry readings, musical performances, and photo exhibits. At one stop, a local high school chorus sang an arrangement of Bridge Over Troubled Water, its harmonies resonating against the skyline. Nearby, an array of survivor-submitted haikus fluttered on wooden posts. Cold river cradle, fear became our lullaby, strength rose with the tide. Families joined the walk alongside rescue divers, Coast Guard officers, and firefighters who remembered the urgency of that afternoon. As they passed each station, survivors paused to share a word of thanks or to revisit a memory, some painful, some glimmering with hope. In this shared journey, they recognized that their lives remained entwined with the Hudson's shifting currents and with each other, bound by a collective story that would never be forgotten. Guardians of the Water. The Hudson's wildlife, once vilified for its role in the bird strike, found new advocates among those who had lived through Flight 1549. Led by biologist and survivor Aisha Patel, a coalition formed to promote sustainable bird hazard management, one that balanced aviation safety with ecological stewardship. They launched Wings Over the Water, an initiative working alongside port authorities to restore wetlands away from flight paths, create controlled waterfowl roost zones, and employ trained raptors to gently guide geese and other at-risk species towards safer habitats. Aisha's own voice held both scientific authority and personal passion. "These birds are not villains," she'd tell airport managers. "They're part of our ecosystem. Our job is to protect both human life and natural life, through respect, collaboration, and innovation." With grant funding and volunteer efforts, the coalition planted native grasses along riverbanks, creating buffer zones that attracted waterfowl away from busy runways. Their research established that healthy wetlands at a safe distance actually reduced bird traffic near terminals, offering a win-win solution born from tragedy's hard lessons. Artisans of Memory. In the village of Ossining, up the river from Manhattan, a public arts collective unveiled its most ambitious work yet, a permanent installation called Sky's Reflection. Set atop a former boatyard, the sculpture comprised undulating stainless steel plates shaped like both feathers and waves. As sunlight shifted, the plates caught glints of sky and water, creating an ever-changing mosaic of light and color. At its center stood two bronze figures, Captain Sullenberger and First Officer Skiles, arms outstretched as if guiding an invisible plane to rest gently on the river's mirror. Survivors attended the unveiling in quiet awe. In the evening light, the sculpture seemed to breathe, Ripples of metal glimmered like foam, while the aviators' figures radiated calm confidence. Children ran their fingers along the curved panels, tracing patterns of light and shadow. For many, the installation felt like a bridge between past and present, a testament to the fear they had faced, the courage they had borrowed from their crew, and the beauty they had helped transform from a site of peril. Stories carried on the tide. Perhaps the most poignant currents of connection flowed through the Hudson's waters themselves. Twice a year, on the ditching anniversary and on National Aviation Day, kayakers launched from riverfront docks, paddling past the approximate ditching coordinates in silent tribute. Participants wore life jackets embroidered with names of passengers and crew, and at the halfway point, a wreath of white roses drifted on the current, each bloom a symbol of remembrance and gratitude. Among the kayakers was Michael, the architect who had once hesitated to fly again, now an avid paddler with a redesigned boat blueprint inspired by the A320's wing shape. As he guided his vessel over gentle swells, he felt every stroke connect him to the river's deep history of commerce, of conflict, and of an unexpected rescue that had demonstrated humanity's capacity for both error and redemption. Other survivors joined fossil hunt excursions along exposed riverbanks at low tide, searching for ancient shells and stones. As they brushed away silt, they talked of resilience and renewal, how, like the Hudson itself, they could weather storms, carve new channels, and emerge changed but unbroken. Circles of care. In community centers perched above the river, peer support circles continued their work. Here, therapists and trained volunteers, many of them survivors themselves, led discussions on ongoing challenges, sleep disturbances, relationship strains, and moments of trigger when a siren wove through traffic noise. Using mindfulness, art therapy, and group coaching, these circles nurtured ongoing healing, reinforcing that survival is not a momentary victory, but an ongoing practice of care and connection. Survivors spoke of the power in giving back, tutoring youth in science, volunteering at wildlife centers, or serving as angel guardians on flights, quietly comforting anxious travelers with a reassuring word or a shared story. In these acts, they transformed their trauma into service, ensuring that the promise made in the cockpit, "I won't let you die," became a living mantra echoing through countless lives. Currents to the future. As the sun dipped below the George Washington Bridge one evening, survivors gazed across the river, its surface rippling with twilight's glow. They saw not only the site of a harrowing descent, but also a living landscape of renewal, wetlands humming with life, sculptures reflecting hope, and gathering places where stories of survival became beacons for others. In that moment, they understood that the miracle on the Hudson was never confined to a single flight or a single day. It lived in the currents of connection they had forged, with nature, with neighbors, and with every heart willing to listen. And as long as those currents flowed, the promise that had carried them through the darkest moments would continue to guide them toward horizons yet unseen. The first light of dawn painted the Hudson skyline in pastel hues, soft pinks, gentle lavenders, and the pale gold of a new day. As the river's currents flowed steadily beneath a silent sky, the survivors of Flight 1549 gathered one last time to close their shared journey and set their hearts toward the future. This was the final chapter of their story, the moment when collective trauma transformed into collective hope. A gathering at the pier. On the morning of the 2-year anniversary, 155 survivors, pilots, flight attendants, first responders, family members, and even curious New Yorkers who had followed the miracle on the Hudson assembled at Pier 61. The wind carried a chill that hinted at winter's approach, but blankets and warm drinks offered comfort against the crisp air. A simple wooden platform, draped in white fabric, stood near the water's edge, bearing 36 flickering lanterns, each inscribed with a name of a passenger, crew, or rescuer whose life had touched that 18th day of January. As participants formed a wide circle, an elder Coast Guard officer read aloud from Sully's cockpit voice recording. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've lost both engines. I'm going to do everything I can to put us down safely." His voice resonated over the river, steady, unwavering, imbued with the promise that had become the story's heartbeat. Around him, survivors closed their eyes, recalling the turbulence beneath their feet, the spray of icy water, and the echo of human resolve in a moment of dire need. Reflections by the water. After the reading, a microphone passed through the circle. One by one, voices rose to share reflections, brief, poignant, and filled with gratitude. A young engineer, inspired by the bird strike analyses, committed his career to developing smarter wildlife detection systems. "Because of that day," he said, "I know that my work can save lives." A flight attendant dedicated her voice to crisis counseling, offering support to passengers triggered by turbulence. "I learned that calm leadership isn't just a protocol, it's an act of kindness." A mother whose child had clutched her hand in the cabin spoke of newfound appreciation for each moment with her family. "Ever since I felt those wings touch water," she whispered, "I've held my daughter a little tighter every night." Tears glistened on cheeks lined by sleep and sobriety. When the lanterns flickered in the cold breeze, survivors saw in their dance of light the fragile beauty of life itself, brief, precious, and all the more radiant for its unpredictability. A release of lanterns. At the circle's center, a long wooden trough of water awaited, a miniaturized river within reach of all hands. Each survivor lit a lantern candle, adding their personal inscription, a prayer, a hope, or a word of thanks. Then, in unison, they placed the lanterns on the water's surface. The river caught them gently, carrying each flicker downstream. As the lanterns drifted, reflections of flame and sky entwined on the river's face. Survivors watched in solemn silence, recognizing that while the lanterns would eventually fade, the light they carried of courage, solidarity, and renewal would endure within every heart present. Stepping toward tomorrow. When the circle closed, survivors formed clusters to embrace and exchange contact information, promising to support each other in the years ahead. Sully and Skiles, standing side by side, spoke quietly to small groups, offering words of encouragement. "You carry your own compass now," Sully said. "Trust it," Jeff added. "Fly toward your dreams," Sully concluded, "and never forget how high you can soar when you lift one another." Epilogue: Beyond the Banks. As the sun climbed higher, survivors dispersed. Some boarded commuter ferries, others returned to their homes across the country, and a few lingered on the pier, absorbing the transformative hush that followed the ceremony. In the days to come, they would return to work, school, and family life, but they carried with them a new perspective: that adversity can forge unbreakable bonds, that crises can reveal reservoirs of compassion, and that the future, however uncertain, always holds the promise of renewal. The Hudson River, indifferent to human stories, continued its endless flow. Yet beneath its surface, the currents carried echoes of bravery and unity, whispered in the rustle of reeds and the gentle lap of water against concrete pilings. And in the sky above, every departing flight traced invisible arcs of possibility, each one a silent homage to the promise that had saved 155 lives. "I won't let you die." Thus ended the final chapter, not with an exclamation point, but with an invitation to carry forward the lesson that when fear meets resolve, hope can rise and life can take flight once more.